Today I have as a guest storyteller on Cricket Corner an old friend of mine, Jay Engel, who is an English professor at St. Mark's School, and I've known him through the school and also through the Southborough Players when we were in a few shows together many years ago. So Jay is going to take us all around the world with some many stories today. Jay?
Thank you,
Welcome.
Libby. Thank you. Well, you know, Halloween was a week ago, and I know I'm a week late, but you don't mind that, do you? And so I thought I'd start today with a spook story. Now, this is a very spooky, very scary story. I don't want you guys to be too spooked out by it. Comes from England, but the version I first heard was from North Carolina when it came over with the colonists, and it's called Mr. Fox. Now, once upon a time, there was a girl by the name of Mary, and she lived in a small house near a great forest, great dark pilloried forest. Now, her mother and father were dead. She was an orphan, but she had 4 brothers. And her brothers lived with her, and she sort of took care of the place for her brothers. And Mary also had a boyfriend, a young man who came a-courting her. And his name was Mr. Fox. Now, Mr. Fox had black, shiny eyes, and he had a thick red mustache, and he had a very thick red beard. And he was very, very handsome, and he was very, very charming. And he would come courting Mary, and he would take tea with her. Every Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Fox came and took tea with her. And this went on for weeks and weeks and months and months. And finally, Mr. Fox said to her one day, "Mary, you know, every week I come to take tea with you. Why don't you come and repay my visit and take tea with me at my house?" And Mary said, "Well, Mr. Fox, where do you live?" And Mr. Fox said, "Well, I have a house in the woods, you know, the great north woods up there." And Mary said, "Oh, no, Mr. Fox. Those are big, dark woods, and I know I'd lose myself in those woods, and I know I'd be terrified." And Mr. Fox said, "Yes, Mary, I understand. That's quite all right. I'll continue coming and visiting you at tea time." Well, one afternoon, Mary was out in the meadow, and she was collecting wildflowers and bluebells and all sorts of beautiful things. And she wasn't paying a great deal of attention what she was doing, and it was a beautiful day, and she went further, and she went further, and she went further. And wouldn't you know it, all she discovered, she was in that dark forest. And she was just a wee little bit lost. So she kept going into that dark forest, and it got bigger and it got darker. And then all of a sudden, she found herself in an opening. And there was a beautiful Tudor house, right in the middle of the forest. A large, beautiful house. It had 3 granite steps that led up to an oaken door. Now, it was very hot, and Mary was very thirsty. So she decided to knock on the door and see if anybody was home and she could get a drink of water. So she knocked on that door, but before she knocked on that door, she happened to see some writing over the lintel of the door, and the writing said, "Be bold, be bold." And Mary decided, all right, I'll be bold, and she opened the door of that house, and she walked in, and there was a beautiful reception hall, a gorgeous reception hall with shining chandeliers and beautiful mirrors with gold frames and felt curtains. But there was nobody at home. She called and called, absolutely nobody at home. But she noticed at the far end there was a circular staircase, a big, broad, wide circular staircase. So she decided to go up that circular staircase, and she ascended the staircase, and she came to the top of the staircase, and there was a great big door, and over that door was some writing, and she looked, and it said, be bold, but not too bold." So she opened the door once more, and she found herself in a bedroom. There's a great, huge 4-poster bed, and on the side of the bed, there was a brass wash basin and a porcelain bowl. And there was a closet, and she looked in the closet, and she opened the closet, and there were some clothes, and she recognized those clothes. There was a cloak, there was a hat, there was a jacket. All of these she recognized. They belonged to Mr. Fox, and all of a sudden Mary realized that this was Mr. Fox's house, and she was in Mr. Fox's bedroom. And as she turned to look around the bedroom, she saw way there in the corner still a third door. And this one was a very, very small door. And she went over to look at it, and over that door, more words were written. Be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood turn cold. And Mary paused for a second. Those were not reassuring words, but she was very, very curious, and she gradually opened that door. It creaked open, and she found herself in an old, dusty room. There were cobwebs all over the place. The room had not been opened for a long time. It was dim and dusky, and she had to adjust her eyesight, but soon she saw that the whole room was dominated by 3 huge vats, 3 great big tubs. And she went over to the first tub, and she looked inside, and there, to her astonishment, the tub was filled with hair, human hair. And she went over to the second vat and looked in, and there was some sticky, orangey, red liquid. And she took her little finger and she put it just in the tub and tasted it, and it had that salty metal taste that only blood can have. Then she went to the third vat, and inside the third vat, bones, knee bones, ankle bones, shin bones, ribs, skulls, all kinds of bones. Well, by this time, Mary was terrified. She wheeled around, turned, dashed across the room, slammed the door, ran out of the bedroom, slammed that door, propelled herself down the great staircase, and down and down and down she came, and she was almost at the bottom of the staircase when she saw out the window, to her horror, there coming across the meadow was none other than Mr. Fox. And he was striding across the meadow, pulling by the hair a screaming, struggling young woman who was trying to get free but couldn't. And Mr. Fox was coming closer and closer, and Mary was looking for some place to hide, and Mr. Fox was that close to the door, and all of a sudden Mary found under the staircase, just a little place where she could hide herself, and she quickly zipped in there, and bang, the door opened, and there was Mr. Fox pulling this poor girl by the hair, and he started to pull her up the staircase, and she, in desperation, grabbed the banister, holding on for dear life, and Mr. Fox whipped out a sword and went wham! And cut off her hand. And as he did so, the hand zipped into the air and flew and dropped in circles and finally dropped in Mary's lap. And Mr. Fox dragged this poor girl up the staircase, and Mary heard a dull thump of a door closing. And then she turned and fled as fast as ever she could. Well, that was a Sunday. On Tuesday, sure enough, Mr. Fox came for tea. And Mary had the tea service out. She had jelly cakes, fine tea. Only this time her 4 brothers were in the room with her. And Mr. Fox came in the room and he looked at Mary and he said, "Mary, you look so pale. You don't look well at all. You look rather sad. Tell me, what's the matter? What's wrong with you?" And Mary said, "Mr. Fox, I haven't slept well of late. I've had dreams, nightmares, terrible dreams. And Mr. Fox replied, well, Mary, you know, I have a certain talent for reading dreams. I can interpret dreams. Why don't you tell me your dreams, and maybe I can interpret them. And then we can get that wonderful smile back on your face. And Mary said, all right, Mr. Fox, I'll tell you my dream. I dreamt, Mr. Fox, that I was in the great dark forest up there in the north, and I came to a clearing, and there was a great beautiful house with stone steps and a great oaken door. And Mr. Fox, it was your house. And Mr. Fox said, oh, it is not so and was not so. Well, that's the way I dreamed, said Mary. And then, said Mary, over the door was written the words, be bold, be bold. Mr. Fox said, is not so, it was not so. And Mary said, that's the way I dreamed, Mr. Fox. And then I went into that door and through the hall. There was a staircase. I went up that staircase. There was a great door. Over the door, it said, be bold, but not too bold. And Mr. Fox said, it is not so and was not so. But Mary replied, that's how I dreamed it, Mr. Fox. And then I went into a bedroom, and Mr. Fox, it was your bedroom, and off to the side was a little door. And I opened that door, and there were 3 great tubs in there, Mr. Fox. And over that door was written the words, be bold, but not too bold, lest your heart's blood turn cold. And again, Mr. Fox said, it was not so and is not so. And Mary said, that's how I dreamed it. And in the first tub, Mr. Fox, was human hair. And in the second tub, Mr. Fox, was blood. And in the third tub, Mr. Fox, were bones. And at this point, Mr. Fox leapt up and cried, it is not so, it was not so, and God forbid it should be so. And Mary said, that's how I dreamed it, Mr. Fox. And I was so frightened, Mr. Fox, I dashed down the staircase as fast as I could, and I got almost down to the staircase, and I saw you coming across the meadow, and you were pulling a poor girl, and she was struggling and screaming, and I tried to hide, and you burst through the door, and she held onto the banister because she was so frightened, and you whipped out your sword, and you cut her hand right off, Mr. Fox. And Mr. Fox cried, it is not so, it was not so, and God forbid it should be so. And Mary said, it is so, it was so, and I have the hand to show. And she pulled out the hand. And at that point, Mary's 4 brothers slew Mr. Fox. But I shan't tell you how they did it, because if I did, your heart's blood would turn cold. And that's the story of Mr. Fox. Second story I want to tell you is a strange story. This is from the Cheyenne Indians, or if you prefer, the Native American tribe that's called Cheyenne, down in the southwestern part of the United States. Now try to imagine the state of Oklahoma. It's sort of shaped like that. And up there in the northwest corner, northwest of Oklahoma City, there's a town called Canton. And just outside of Canton, there is an enormous pit, great, huge hole. And at the bottom of that hole are bones. Now, the geologists at the University of Oklahoma will tell you that those bones came from animals that had been trapped a long, long time ago and were buried. But the Cheyenne will tell you a different story. The Cheyenne, no different. And this is how the Cheyenne tell it. Now, we're going way, way, way back in time. Now, you may know the Cheyenne were famous for being horsemen. They were great horsemen. But we're going back so far that we're going back to the time before the Cheyenne even had horses. They didn't have guns. They didn't have iron. Their weapons were made of stone. And everywhere they went, they had to walk. So they had wreaths made of moccasins. They take moccasins and stitch them together with drawstrings. And so they'd have these great braids of moccasins. And as soon as one moccasin gave out, they'd be able to have another moccasin. Well, once upon a time, a long time ago, again, remember, before the Cheyenne had guns or iron or even horses, the Cheyenne went on a buffalo hunt. There were 49 of them, 49 young braves and their chief. And they went up into the western mountains, and they were fortunate. They didn't meet any enemy. No Navajo, no Ute, no Arapaho. And down the western mountains they came, and they came to the Staked Plains. Now let me tell you about the Staked Plains. The Staked Plains was a desert. An enormous, huge, dry, dangerous desert. And it was called the Staked Plains because another tribe, the Comanche, had taken yucca plants and they had hammered the stems of yucca plants into the earth as a trail to lead to water holes, so that travelers in the desert would always have a trail of these yucca plants, and they know just where the water holes would be, and they wouldn't get lost in the desert and die of thirst. And so our band of Cheyenne warriors found the trail of the yucca plants and started off towards the water hole. Now this was in the morning. Along about mid-morning, some of the braves who were more sharp-eyed than the others saw something way, way, way over there in the horizon. And at first they thought it was a mirage because, you know, in the desert you get mirages. And so they looked and looked and looked very closely, but obviously it was not a mirage. It was something real. And they looked, and it looked like a great hill of glass. It was something round, and it was bright, and it was shining. And they watched and watched and watched, and it came closer and closer, and all of a sudden they discovered what this thing was. It was an enormous water turtle, a huge water turtle. And it was lumbering its way closer and closer to this band of Cheyenne warriors. Well, the warriors, who were all young, turned to their chief and looked at him and said, "What is this and what should we do?" And the chief said, "Well, it may be a great blessing, but then again it may be a great danger. So stay back and let's see. Just watch it, but keep your distance." And the great turtle came closer and closer and closer, and soon it was just where the Cheyenne warriors were, and they sort of walked along with it as it lumbered its way along, not paying any attention to them at all. And then one of the warriors, he was a little bit more imaginative and a little bit braver and a little bit more tired and maybe a little bit more foolish than some of the others, decided, this is an enormous, enormous water turtle. Look at that great big back. And here it is, hot, I'm tired, I'm thirsty, and he decided to jump on the back of the water turtle and hitch a ride. And so he did. And he looked down at all the others, and he sort of smiled and he waved at them, and he said, "Look at me, I've got a wonderful ride here." And some of them decided, hey, this is a very good idea. So one after another, they all jumped on the back of this water turtle. And pretty soon, we had all 49 Cheyenne warriors on the back of the water turtle. That is, all of them, of course, except the chief who walked along. Well, after a while, they got curious about this huge creature. And so they took their stone weapons and they tried to pry apart the shell to get down to the muscles and see what makes this thing work. They couldn't do it. They couldn't penetrate the shell. They couldn't find anything. Well, after a while, they started to talk about this great creature whose back they were on. And some thought this was just a wonderful thing, but there were others who thought, I don't know, there's something uncanny here. There's something not quite right here. This is not natural. And the two sides began to dispute and have an argument. And finally, one of the Cheyenne braves had enough, and he said, I'm getting off. I'm getting off. And so he decided to get off. Only He couldn't. He was stuck on the back of the water turtle. And he looked around at his friends, and they saw his problem, and they decided to get off too, and they all tried to get off the back of the water turtle, and they couldn't. They were all glued. They were all stuck. They couldn't move. And so they turned to the chief and, help us. You're old. You're wise. You know what to say to these creatures. We're trapped. We're stuck here on the water turtle's back. Get us off. So the old chief approached the turtle and said, mighty turtle, please, my young friends are just foolish. They meant you no harm. Please, you're so strong. If you're so strong, you should be merciful. Show your mercy because you're so strong. The turtle apparently didn't even hear. The turtle just kept going its way, plodding along. Well, the warriors now were angry. So they took their stone weapons and they started to smash them against the back of the water turtle, and the weapons broke. And one of the warriors took his stone hatchet and went smash with all of his might right in the head of the water turtle. And the hatchet went in that deep, right at the top of the head of the water turtle. And it didn't hurt the water turtle at all. The turtle didn't even move. The turtle apparently didn't even feel anything. Now the young braves were no longer angry. They were terrified. They were panic-stricken. And again, in desperation, they turned to their chief. Please, for heaven's sakes, say something to the water turtle. And again, the chief approached the water turtle, and now tears were running down his eyes. And he said, please, O mighty turtle, please, my young friends didn't mean to hurt you. You're so strong. Be merciful. Show your mercy, and we will honor you. We will do the sun dance for you. But the turtle apparently didn't hear them at all. And again, the warriors looked at their chief. Please, do something. Do something. Well, by now it was late afternoon. And across the horizon, they spotted something which was not a mirage. It was real. It was very, very real. It was a huge lake. And the water turtle was going straight for that lake, with all 49 young Cheyenne braves trapped on its back. And when the braves realized what their danger was and what their fate was going to be, again they turned to the chief, but the chief said to them, my young friends, there's nothing more I can do for you. This was a great mystery, and you haven't shown respect. You must be punished. And the young braves understood what their chief had said. And all their fear and all their panic and all their anger was gone. And they understood because they had been wrong. And so once, a final time, they turned to their chief and they said, go back to the village and tell our mothers and fathers, our brothers and sisters, our sons and daughters, our grandparents what has happened. And next spring, bring the whole village here so that you can mourn for us. And the old chief promised he'd do that. And the turtle approached the huge lake with all 49 warriors on his back. And first one great foot went into the lake, and then another great foot went into the lake. And the turtle sank into the lake, down, 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 down. And all 49 young Cheyenne warriors disappeared. For a moment, the chief, with tears streaming down his eyes, sighed and waited. Then he went back to the village, and he was greeted by the entire village. They all came out. It must have been a terrible battle. It must have been a... No. It was no battle, my friends. There was no battle. It was only a great mystery. And next spring, when the grass was thick and high as the hocks of horses, the whole village crossed the western mountains and came to the great lake. But there was no lake. There was only a great pit, a great hole, and at the bottom of the hole were only bones. And that is how the Cheyenne tell that story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay, for coming in and telling us these stories. One of those stories you got from a record, didn't you? Or from live from the folk tellers? Did you hear that?
Yes.
Yeah, because you've heard the
Yeah.
women from
Yes,
South Carolina
the two,
that tell
yes, the two Carolinians.
Yes, and this Cheyenne story you got from a book?
The
from a little
Cheyenne
book?
story I got from a collection of Native American. Yeah,
And that's
strange. Isn't that a strange story? Different story. Very different.
So if any of you were doing reports on Oklahoma, as you go through your United States geography, that's a story from Oklahoma, from the Cheyenne people. What is the name of that story?
Well, good question. The story is called 49 Braves and a Turtle.
That sums it up.
That's
about it.
49 Braves and a Turtle.
Thank you very much for sharing those with us today.
Thanks for having me.